I still remember the moment my stomach dropped, because the crane hook was moving, and the screen said there was nothing attached to it. The ocean below was invisible that night, swallowed by fog so thick it felt like the rig was floating in empty space. When I took this job, they told me there were 11 strange rules I had to follow if I wanted to finish my contract alive, and I laughed like anyone would. Now I understand those rules weren't for safety inspections or company policy. They were for survival. I remember the first time I broke one of them and how the air inside the cab stopped feeling empty even though nothing had changed. The worst part is that whatever noticed me that night hasn't stopped watching since. Rule 1: never operate the crane after midnight unless your lift has a confirmed physical load. The card with the rules was taped inside the crane cab right next to the emergency shutdown lever, and I read Rule 1. Never operate the crane after midnight unless your lift has a confirmed physical load every night before my shift started. Midnight on an oil rig doesn't feel like time passing, it feels like something switching on, like the sea itself is holding its breath. That night, the fog rolled in early and wrapped around the structure until the lights looked smeared and distant. I told myself it didn't matter because I wasn't scheduled to lift anything after 12 anyway. That thought didn't last long. At 12:03, my radio buzzed with a request from deck operations asking me to swing the crane toward the eastern platform. I checked the load manifest slowly, then checked it again, because mistakes out there don't just cost money. There was no equipment listed, no containers, no personnel cage, not even a maintenance request. I keyed the mic and told them there was nothing assigned for lifting. The reply came back late, strained and far too calm for the situation. They told me it wasn't on the manifest yet and that I should just reposition the hook so they could attach it manually. I remember staring at the fog beyond the cab window, watching it move in slow waves like it was breathing. Something about the request felt wrong, not urgent, not rushed, just quiet and final. I asked them why it couldn't wait until morning. The radio stayed silent long enough for my heartbeat to feel loud in my ears. When the supervisor finally answered, he said delays weren't an option and reminded me that refusal would be noted in my file. I had bills back home and a contract that paid better than anything I'd ever worked before. I told myself the rule was probably written after some idiot dropped an empty hook into the water and damaged equipment. I rested my hand on the controls, feeling the vibration of the engine beneath my feet. That's when I made the decision I still replay every night. As the crane arm began to move, the load screen stayed at 0, glowing steady and reassuring like it always did. The hook descended into the fog, disappearing faster than it should have, like the darkness was pulling it down. I leaned forward in my seat, trying to keep the hook lights in sight, but the fog swallowed them completely. The radio clicked once, softly, without anyone speaking. I told myself it was just interference from the weather. A strange tension crept through the crane arm, subtle at first, like resistance from wind or current. I checked the gauges, expecting to see fluctuation, but everything stayed perfectly normal. The crane shouldn't have felt heavy, yet my hands tightened on the controls without me realizing it. The fog below shifted in a way that made my chest feel tight, like something large had moved just out of view. I remember thinking how quiet the rig sounded, even with machines running. Then the hook stopped descending, even though I hadn't released the control. I froze, watching the cable stretch downward into nothing, feeling a pressure in my ears like a deep dive without water. The load indicator still read 0, bright and steady, mocking me. I whispered to myself that it was just a mechanical hiccup, that steel does strange things in cold air. That lie didn't hold for long. The crane arm jerked, not violently, but with intent, like someone testing weight before committing to a pull. My breath caught as the cable twitched again, slower this time, deliberate. The fog below parted for just a second, enough for the hook light to flicker back into view. What I saw attached to it didn't register right away, because my brain refused to name it. The load screen still said 0. I reached for the radio to call for confirmation, but my hand stopped halfway there when the cable tightened again. Whatever was below the hook pulled upward, not hard, just enough to let me know it wasn't empty. The crane responded automatically, compensating for a weight it claimed didn't exist. My mouth felt dry as I watched the fog close back in around the cable. That was when I realized the rule hadn't been written to prevent accidents. The radio crackled again, and this time someone spoke, but it wasn't the supervisor. The voice was close, too close, like it was speaking from inside the cab instead of through the speaker. It asked me calmly to keep lifting, said everything was fine, said this was normal. I didn't answer because I suddenly understood that acknowledging it might count as permission. The crane arm trembled as the unseen weight adjusted itself. I cut the controls and the crane froze mid-lift, the sudden stillness making the fog feel heavier. The tension on the cable remained, steady and patient, as if whatever was attached understood it could wait. My heart hammered so hard I thought I might pass out in the seat. I stared at the emergency shutdown lever, knowing that pulling it would leave whatever was below exactly where it wanted to be. The radio went quiet again, and the silence felt worse than any sound. The fog began to thin, just enough for me to see the cable stretching downward farther than it should have, as if it had lengthened on its own. The hook light flickered once more, and I saw movement where nothing should have been hanging. My hands shook as I released the brake and let the hook descend back into the fog. The tension eased slowly, reluctantly, like a grip letting go. When the cable finally went slack, I pulled the hook back up and locked the crane in place. The load screen still read 0, unchanged, as if the last few minutes had never happened. I sat there until morning, afraid to move, afraid that acknowledging what I'd seen would make it real again. When the sun came up, the fog vanished, and the sea looked ordinary. The rule card stayed taped to the wall, and I understood why no one ever joked about it. Morning light didn't make me feel safer. It just made everything I'd seen feel more real. And as I climbed down from the crane cab, my legs still felt weak. I wiped my hands on my coveralls and told myself I'd imagined the tension on the cable. That stress can play tricks on you when you're alone above black water for too long. Still, I couldn't stop thinking about Rule 2. If the hook comes back wet after a dry lift, do not log it and do not ask why, because that was the next line on the laminated card. I hadn't paid much attention to it before, thinking seawater was everywhere and a wet hook meant nothing. Now, with the sun rising and the fog burning off, that rule felt like a warning I was standing too close to. I went back up to the crane after breakfast, because routine is the only thing that keeps fear from settling in your bones out there. The rig looked normal in daylight, metal gleaming, waves rolling gently, crew shouting over engines like it was any other day. I climbed into the cab and checked the controls, half expecting something to be different, but everything responded the way it always had. The hook hung below the arm, visible now, swaying slightly in the breeze. That's when I noticed the water dripping from it. At first I thought it was leftover spray from the night fog, clinging longer than usual. But the drops fell slow and heavy, hitting the metal deck far below in a steady rhythm. I leaned closer to the window, squinting, and saw dark streaks running along the cable where it fed back into the drum. The sea below was calm, and the hook hadn't touched the water since the last scheduled lift days ago. My stomach tightened as I tried to explain it away. I grabbed my radio and called down to deck operations, asking if anyone had hosed down the crane overnight. The response came back quick and confused, telling me no one had been near it since my shift ended. I laughed it off, said it was probably condensation, and ended the call before they could ask more questions. Something in me knew that explaining it would make it worse, like speaking a name aloud. I wiped the inside of the cab window with my sleeve and told myself to focus on work. The rest of the morning passed without incident, but I couldn't stop noticing the hook. Every time I swung it for a real lift, it came back exactly as expected, dry except for the usual spray. But when it hung idle, unused, droplets formed again, thick and slow, as if it had been pulled from deep water and left to drain. I started timing it in my head, watching how long it took for the first drop to fall. It always happened when I wasn't looking directly at it. Around midday, I went down to the maintenance office to file routine paperwork, and that's when I noticed something missing. The previous night's shift log was gone from the binder. Not torn out, not misplaced, just never there. I asked the senior operator about it, trying to sound casual, and he gave me a look that shut me up instantly. He told me logs get reviewed and removed all the time, then changed the subject like the question had never been asked. That was the first time I realized the rules weren't just for crane operators. After lunch, the heat settled over the rig and made everything feel sluggish. I climbed back into the cab, sweat already sticking my shirt to my back, and checked the hook again. It was dripping steadily now, leaving a small dark patch on the deck below that no one seemed to notice. I watched a crewman walk right through it without looking down, his boots leaving wet prints that vanished after a few steps. The water didn't smell like salt. I leaned out of the cab and took a closer look, my heart pounding as I did something I knew I shouldn't. The drops clung to the metal longer than water should have, stretching before falling, catching the light in a way that made my eyes ache. I told myself it was oil residue, or some chemical runoff, anything that fit the world I understood. My hand hovered inches from the cable before I pulled it back, suddenly afraid of what touching it might mean. Fear has a way of teaching you restraint. That evening, during shift change, a new guy named Harris came up to relieve me early. He was younger, still carried that confidence people have before the job strips it away. He noticed the wet patch on the deck and asked me if the crane had been leaking. I shrugged and told him it was probably condensation, using the same lie I'd told myself. He laughed and said, "Equipment out here does stranger things than that." I didn't correct him. As I was climbing down the ladder, I heard him key the radio and comment on the dripping hook. My grip tightened, and I paused halfway down, listening. He joked about logging it as a maintenance issue, said maybe the crane was sweating from working too hard. Someone on the other end of the radio didn't laugh. The channel went quiet, and I felt a cold pressure settle between my shoulders. I finished my descent and walked away without turning back, every instinct telling me distance mattered. That night, I couldn't sleep, lying in my bunk, listening to the hum of the rig and the distant sound of waves against steel. I kept picturing the hook, dripping in the dark, unseen by anyone who didn't know to look. I wondered how many people before me had noticed and ignored it. I wondered how many hadn't. Near midnight, the alarms didn't sound, but something woke me anyway, a sense of being watched that pressed against my chest. I sat up and listened, straining to hear something out of place, but the rig sounded normal, too normal. I checked my watch and realized Harris would be alone in the crane cab by now. The thought made my throat dry. I didn't go to the crane, didn't call anyone, didn't break routine. I lay back down and stared at the ceiling, counting breaths until morning. When the sun finally rose, the rig buzzed with activity, but there was an empty space where Harris should have been. No one said his name, and no announcement was made. By the time I climbed back into the crane cab, someone else was already assigned to his shift. The hook hung motionless, dry and clean, like it had never dripped at all. The dark patch on the deck was gone, scrubbed away or absorbed. I couldn't tell which. I checked the logbook later and saw no mention of Harris, no incident report, no missing person notice. It was like he'd never signed on in the first place. That's when I understood why the rule said not to ask why. That night, as I sat alone in the crane cab again, I felt the familiar tension of being watched return. I glanced down at the laminated card, my eyes drifting to the next line below. My hands shook slightly as I rested them on the controls, knowing the rules didn't exist to protect the rig. They existed to decide who stayed, and whatever lived in the space between steel and sea had already noticed me paying attention. I didn't sleep after Harris vanished, and by the time my shift began again, my body felt like it had been hollowed out and refilled with noise. The crane cab smelled the same, oil and warm metal, but the air felt thicker, harder to breathe. I sat down, stared out at the water, and thought about Rule 3. If something appears beneath the hook that should not be there, you must not describe it to anyone. Remembering how strange that sentence had sounded when I first read it. Back then, I assumed it meant debris, maybe sea life caught in equipment, something unpleasant but explainable. After Harris, I understood it was about protecting more than my sanity. The night started quiet, too quiet, like the rig was holding its breath along with me. I ran routine lifts before midnight, real loads with real weight, metal crates and equipment cages that behaved exactly how physics said they should. Every movement felt exaggerated, each vibration traveling up my arms and into my chest. I kept my eyes on the gauges and my hands steady on the controls. I told myself I was just tired. Just after midnight, the fog rolled in again, faster than before, swallowing the lower half of the rig until the water disappeared completely. The lights below blurred into dull halos, and the horizon vanished like it had been erased. I checked the schedule, knowing nothing was assigned for lifting, and locked the crane in neutral. My heartbeat slowed slightly when I reminded myself I wasn't breaking any rules. That comfort didn't last. I noticed movement below the hook before I noticed the hook itself. The darkness under the cab window seemed to shift, not like waves or fog, but like something adjusting its position. I leaned forward despite myself, trying to make sense of it, and that's when the hook light flickered on its own. The beam cut through the fog, just enough to show empty air beneath it. Empty, except for something darker than the dark around it. At first, my mind refused to give it shape. It wasn't solid, not exactly, but it wasn't water either. It hung there, suspended beneath the hook without touching it, like it didn't need metal to stay where it was. I felt a pressure behind my eyes as I tried to understand what I was seeing. The more I focused, the less it made sense. I reminded myself not to move, not to react, not to speak. My radio sat inches from my hand, and the urge to call someone pressed against my chest like a physical weight. I wanted confirmation, wanted another set of eyes to tell me it was real or imagined. The rule echoed in my head, not as words on a card, but as instinct. Some things become permanent once they're shared. The shape shifted again, slowly, deliberately, like it was aware of my attention. The fog around it thinned, instead of thickening, revealing edges that refused to stay still. Every time I thought I understood what I was looking at, it changed, not suddenly, but patiently. My mouth went dry as I realized it was positioning itself directly beneath the hook, waiting. The crane reacted before I did. A faint tension traveled up the arm, subtle enough that the gauges barely acknowledged it. The load screen stayed unchanged, calm and unreadable. I forced myself to keep my hands away from the controls, even as instinct screamed to pull the hook back. I knew movement would invite response. Stillness felt safer, even if it meant staying exposed. The radio crackled once, softly, and my breath caught as I realized the channel was open. No one spoke, but I felt certain I wasn't alone on the line. The presence beneath the hook shifted again, rising just enough for the light to brush against it. That's when I saw depth where there shouldn't have been any. Space folded inward, like looking into a hole that didn't end. I swallowed hard and leaned back in my seat, breaking eye contact with the window. My reflection stared back at me, pale and drawn, eyes too wide. For a moment, I considered closing the cab blinds, pretending none of this was happening, but I knew that would be worse. Whatever was below wanted to be acknowledged, not hidden from. The tension increased, not enough to trigger alarms, but enough to be undeniable. The crane arm creaked under a weight it still claimed didn't exist. My hands shook as I rested them on my thighs, fingers digging into fabric to keep from moving. The fog outside pulsed faintly, like something breathing in a rhythm that wasn't mine. I counted my breaths, trying to stay grounded. A voice came through the radio then, low and calm, asking me what I was seeing. It used my name, spoken perfectly, like we'd known each other for years. I froze, every muscle locking at once. The urge to answer burned in my throat, to explain, to describe, to share the impossible thing hanging beneath my crane. I bit down hard enough to taste blood. The voice didn't repeat itself. It waited, patient, confident, like it knew silence was temporary. The shape below the hook rose another inch, and the pressure in my ears intensified. I squeezed my eyes shut, refusing to look, refusing to give it definition. Darkness pressed against my eyelids, but it felt safer than the alternative. When I opened my eyes again, the hook light was off. The fog closed in, thick and uniform, hiding everything below. The tension on the crane arm eased slowly, like a hand releasing its grip. I exhaled shakily, only then realizing I'd been holding my breath. The radio went dead. No static, no hum, just nothing. I stayed like that for a long time, afraid that any movement would bring it back. Eventually the fog thinned and the water reappeared, dark and empty and normal. The hook hung motionless, exactly where it should have been. I didn't log the incident. I didn't mention it to anyone. Later that morning, during shift change, a mechanic asked me why I looked so tired. I opened my mouth to answer and felt the memory surge forward, vivid and heavy. Images pressed against my tongue, demanding to be named. I closed my mouth and shook my head instead, saying I just hadn't slept well. The lie tasted like relief. That afternoon I found a new name scratched faintly into the metal wall inside the crane cab, right below Harris's. It was mine. The letters were shallow, almost careful, like whoever carved them didn't want to leave marks. I rubbed at them with my thumb, but they didn't fade. The laminated card fluttered slightly in a breeze that shouldn't have existed. As night approached again, I sat alone in the cab, staring at the water below, knowing the rules weren't finished with me. Whatever had been beneath the hook hadn't left, it had only stepped back. I could feel it waiting, learning, adjusting. My eyes drifted to the next line on the card, my chest tightening as I realized how much worse things could get. The name carved into the metal stayed with me all evening, and no matter how many times I told myself it was a prank, my hands wouldn't stop shaking. I sat in the crane cab as darkness settled, staring at the controls like they might accuse me of something. The laminated card felt heavier than before, and when my eyes reached Rule 4, if the crane begins to move on its own, you must not fight it and you must not stop it, my throat tightened. I remembered how confident I'd once felt sitting up here, believing steel and hydraulics only obeyed human hands. That confidence was gone now, replaced by the understanding that the crane listened to more than me. The night air was still, not even wind brushing against the cab, and the sea below looked flat and lifeless. I ran my usual checks, slower than normal, triple-checking every switch and lock. Everything read normal, steady, obedient. That should have reassured me, but instead it felt like calm behavior before something learned a new trick. I kept my hands folded in my lap, afraid touching the controls would be seen as an invitation. For a long time nothing happened, and I started to believe maybe this night would pass quietly. My breathing slowed, my shoulders loosened, and I leaned back in the seat. That was when the crane arm shifted slightly to the left. It wasn't sudden or violent, just a smooth adjustment, like someone nudging it into a better position. I froze, watching the movement finish and settle as if it had always been meant to rest there. I checked the controls immediately, heart racing, but they hadn't moved. Every lever sat exactly where I'd left it. The load screen stayed calm, offering no warning or explanation. I whispered to myself that it was probably a hydraulic release, pressure equalizing, something mechanical and boring. The crane answered by moving again. This time it rotated farther, slow and deliberate, the massive arm sweeping through the air with a confidence that didn't belong to malfunction. The cab vibrated gently beneath me, not shaking, not struggling, just following instructions I hadn't given. My hands lifted on instinct, fingers twitching toward the emergency stop. I stopped myself inches away, sweat breaking out along my neck. The rule wasn't a suggestion, it was a boundary. The crane continued its motion, turning toward open water where the lights didn't reach. The fog thickened ahead of it, gathering like it had been called. I felt small inside the cab, a passenger instead of an operator. Every nerve screamed to regain control, to assert that I was still the one in charge. Fear pressed against my ribs, heavy and insistent. As the arm reached its new position, the hook began to descend without command. The cable fed out smoothly, faster than gravity alone should allow. I watched the numbers tick down on the depth readout, my mouth dry. The ocean below swallowed the hook completely, the light disappearing into darkness. I told myself not to panic, that resistance would make things worse. The crane paused, holding the hook somewhere deep below, as if waiting for approval it no longer needed. The silence inside the cab felt loud, broken only by the soft hum of machinery. My reflection in the glass looked pale and distant, eyes tracking movements I didn't control. I wondered if this was how Harris had felt before he vanished. The thought made my chest ache. Without warning, the crane began to lift. The cable tightened, and tension traveled up the arm, settling into the cab like a weight. The load screen flickered, but didn't register anything meaningful. Whatever was attached didn't exist in any way the system could measure. I focused on staying still, keeping my hands away from the controls, reminding myself that fighting it would only make it notice me more. The arm rose higher, bringing something closer to the surface. I didn't look directly down, afraid of what acknowledgement might do. Instead, I watched the reflection in the window, saw darkness shifting where light should have been. The crane adjusted its angle slightly, compensating for balance like an experienced operator would. That's when I realized it had learned from watching us. The radio came alive with quiet chatter from other parts of the rig, ordinary voices talking about maintenance and schedules. No one sounded alarmed. No one mentioned the crane moving on its own. I wondered if they couldn't see it, or if they'd learned not to comment. The isolation felt intentional, like a test. My heartbeat thudded in my ears as the cable continued to rise. When the hook emerged from the water, it wasn't empty. Something hung just below it, not attached, but held in place by proximity alone. Water poured off it in heavy sheets, splashing back into the sea. I stared at the shape only long enough to know it was wrong, then forced my eyes away. Describing it, even to myself, felt dangerous. The crane didn't stop. It swung the load inward, slow and careful, like it was protecting something fragile. My hands curled into fists as it brought the shape closer to the rig. The fog parted around it, refusing to cling the way it had before. I could feel a pressure building in the cab, like altitude without ascent. The crane wanted to show me something. As the arm reached its highest point, the shape below the hook shifted, reacting to the nearness of steel and light. I felt an urge to speak, to name what I was seeing, to make it real in the only way humans know how. I swallowed the words and stared at the floor. Instead, silence felt like obedience. Suddenly the crane stopped moving. The hook hung still, suspended between sea and sky. The pressure eased, and the air felt breathable again. I waited, afraid to move, afraid the slightest reaction would restart whatever process I'd just endured. After a long moment, the crane reversed its motion on its own, lowering the hook back toward the water. The shape descended with it, never touching the metal, never drifting away. When it disappeared beneath the surface, the fog rushed in to fill the empty space. The cable went slack, and the crane returned to its original position, as if nothing had happened. The controls remained untouched, innocent. I exhaled shakily, muscles aching from tension. When morning came, the rig looked normal again. Sun glinting off steel, crew moving about their duties. No one mentioned unusual crane activity. The maintenance logs showed nothing out of order. I sat in the cab, staring at my hands, realizing they'd stayed clean the entire night. I hadn't done anything, and somehow that mattered more than action ever could. Before my shift ended, I checked the inside wall of the cab again. Another name had been added beneath mine, carved shallow and careful. I didn't recognize it. The list was growing. As I stepped out into the daylight, I felt the weight of the next line on the card waiting for me. The rules weren't finished teaching me what they took from those who stayed. I went back into the cab after sunrise, pretending the new name carved into the wall didn't exist, pretending the list hadn't grown overnight. Day shifts were supposed to be easier, louder, safer, but something had shifted after watching the crane move on its own. The rig felt thinner somehow, like the space between things had stretched. I sat down and reread the laminated card, my eyes lingering on Rule 5. If you hear your name spoken from below the crane, you must not answer, even in your head. And for the first time I understood why it specified silence of thought as well as voice. Some rules aren't about what you do, they're about what you allow inside you. The day passed without incident, but the quiet followed me like a shadow. Crew members joked nearby, radios buzzed, machinery groaned in familiar rhythms, yet it all felt distant, like I was listening through water. I kept glancing at the hook, half expecting it to drip again, but it stayed dry, ordinary, obedient. That should have comforted me. Instead, it felt like the calm between breaths before something speaks. By the time my night shift started, exhaustion had dulled the edge of my fear. That scared me more than panic ever could. Fatigue makes rules feel negotiable, like suggestions instead of barriers. I climbed into the cab, closed the door and checked the time. Midnight was still an hour away. As darkness settled, the ocean below turned into a single unbroken surface, reflecting nothing back at me. The fog hadn't rolled in yet, but the air felt heavy, charged. I focused on routine, running checks. I'd already run twice, listening to the hum of systems doing what they were supposed to do. The crane stayed still. The hook hung motionless. Everything waited. A little after midnight, the first sound reached me. So soft I almost dismissed it. It came from below, not through the radio, not through the metal of the rig, but through the open space beneath the cab. At first it was just a shift in pressure, a change in how the air vibrated. I leaned forward, frowning, trying to decide if I'd imagined it. Then it happened again. It wasn't loud. It wasn't clear. It felt like the beginning of speech without words. The shape of a voice forming before sound. My skin prickled, every hair on my arms lifting at once. I stayed still, listening without wanting to, my body reacting before my mind could catch up. The sound carried intention. The third time it came, it resolved into something unmistakable, a single word, spoken slowly, carefully, from somewhere far below the crane. My name, not shouted, not whispered, but spoken the way someone says your name when they already know you're listening. The sound slid up through the darkness and settled into my chest like it belonged there. My mouth opened before I realized it, not to speak, but to breathe. The urge to respond was overwhelming, not because I was scared, but because it felt rude not to. The voice sounded patient, familiar, like a coworker calling up to ask a simple question. I clenched my jaw shut and stared at the control panel, forcing my eyes to focus on numbers and lights. Silence felt like defiance. The voice spoke again, repeating my name with a slight change in tone. There was warmth in it now, reassurance, like it understood my hesitation. I felt a strange pressure behind my eyes, a pull inward, as if answering wouldn't just be spoken aloud, but would happen automatically inside my head. Thoughts drifted toward forming a reply, a simple acknowledgement. I pushed them away as hard as I could. My heart pounded so hard, I was sure it could be heard outside the cab. I pressed my hands flat against my thighs, grounding myself in the feel of fabric and muscle. The voice below waited, unhurried, confident. It knew time favored it, not me. I realized then that the rule wasn't about politeness or curiosity, it was about consent. The crane shuddered slightly, not moving, just acknowledging the presence beneath it. The hook swayed, barely perceptible, like something had brushed past it. The voice spoke again, closer this time, my name sounding clearer, sharper. Images flooded my mind uninvited, memories of home, of conversations where answering my name had always been harmless. My teeth ground together as I fought the instinct. I squeezed my eyes shut and focused on breathing, counting each inhale and exhale. The sound of my own breath felt loud in the enclosed space. I imagined my thoughts as closed doors, each one locked and sealed. The voice pressed against them, testing, probing, patient. It didn't get angry. That made it worse. Minutes passed, or seconds. I couldn't tell which. The voice continued, repeating my name with subtle variations, like it was learning which version felt most effective. Sometimes it sounded tired, sometimes amused, sometimes concerned. Each change pulled at something different inside me. I understood then how easy it would be for someone to answer without realizing they had. The pressure built, not physical, but mental, a heaviness that made thinking feel slow and thick. I caught myself imagining what I would say if I responded, crafting a reply in my mind. Panic flared as I realized even that might count. I forced my thoughts away, repeating meaningless words silently, anything to keep my name from forming internally. My head throbbed with the effort. The crane arm creaked softly as weight shifted somewhere below, though nothing registered on the gauges. The voice paused, then spoke again, using my name followed by a question I couldn't quite hear. The meaning pressed against me anyway, an invitation to engage, to clarify, to step closer in whatever way it required. I stayed still, sweating, shaking, silent. Finally, after what felt like hours, the voice stopped. The silence that followed was heavier than anything before it. I opened my eyes slowly, afraid the sound would return the moment I acknowledged its absence. The hook hung motionless. The water below looked empty and dark. My head ached like I'd been screaming, even though I hadn't made a sound. I sat there long after, afraid that thinking about what had happened would somehow count as response. When my shift ended, I climbed down from the cab on unsteady legs. The inside wall greeted me with another change. Beneath the newest name, faint and shallow, was a blank space where another should have been. My name hadn't moved, not yet. As I walked away, I realized something cold and certain. The voice hadn't been trying to scare me. It had been trying to introduce itself, and it had learned exactly how close it could get without breaking me. The next rule waited, and I knew it wouldn't be about silence. I didn't want to read the next line on the card, but my eyes drifted there anyway, as I stepped back into the cab for another night shift. The air felt wrong from the start, heavy in a way I couldn't explain. And when I remembered Rule 6, if the sea goes completely still, you must leave the crane cab immediately and not look down, a slow chill crept up my spine. I'd worked offshore long enough to know the ocean never truly rests. Even on calm nights, it breathes, it shifts, it moves. Absolute stillness meant something had taken its place. At first, everything looked normal. The waves rolled gently, catching light from the rig, and the sound of water against steel carried faintly upward. I settled into my seat, telling myself not to borrow fear from the future. The crane stayed locked, the hook hanging idle and dry. For a brief moment, I allowed myself to believe the night might pass without incident. Then the motion stopped, not gradually, not like the sea calming before a storm, but all at once, as if someone had pressed pause on the surface below. The water flattened into a perfect dark mirror, reflecting the rig lights without distortion. No ripples, no sway, no movement at all. My breath caught as my body reacted before my mind could catch up. The memory of the rules slammed into me, like instinct. I stood up too fast, the chair scraping softly behind me as panic surged. Every part of me wanted to lean forward, to look down and understand what could silence an ocean. Curiosity burned hotter than fear, sharp and insistent. I forced my gaze upward, fixing it on the inside wall of the cab, on the scratches and names carved into the metal. Looking down felt like permission. The stillness pressed upward, tangible now, like a presence rising without sound. The usual background noise of the rig felt distant, muted, as if wrapped in insulation. My ears rang slightly, adjusting to the absence of movement below. I stepped toward the cab door, heart hammering, each movement feeling slower than it should have been. The urge to glance down followed me like a hand on my neck. As I reached for the door handle, something shifted in my peripheral vision. Not movement, exactly, but a change in how light behaved, like reflections bending where they shouldn't. I kept my eyes locked forward, focusing on the metal frame of the door. Sweat slid down my back despite the cool night air. Leaving felt urgent in a way I couldn't explain. The door resisted slightly when I pulled it open, as if pressure on the other side didn't want it to move. I leaned into it, muscles straining, refusing to look anywhere but straight ahead. The stillness deepened, the mirror below growing darker, though I refused to see it directly. My chest tightened as the sense of being observed intensified. Whatever caused the sea to stop moving was aware of me noticing. I stepped out onto the platform, the open air hitting me like a shock. The moment my feet left the cab, the pressure eased just enough for me to breathe. I kept my head level, eyes fixed on the opposite railing, and closed the door behind me without turning back. The crane loomed behind me, silent and obedient. For now, I didn't trust it. Halfway across the platform, the sounds of the rig returned suddenly, crashing back in like a wave breaking. I heard water moving again, metal groaning, voices somewhere far off. Relief washed through me so fast, my knees nearly buckled. I leaned against a railing, gripping cold steel, forcing myself not to look down even now. The rule hadn't said when it would be safe again. Someone called my name from behind, a crewman asking if everything was all right. The sound of a human voice grounded me, pulled me back into my body. I nodded without turning, said I needed a minute, and waited until my breathing steadied. When I finally allowed myself to glance toward the sea, the surface was moving again, waves rolling like nothing had happened. It looked harmless, ordinary, innocent. I returned to the crane cab later, only after convincing myself the danger had passed. Inside, everything was exactly where I'd left it. Controls untouched, screens steady, but the inside wall had changed again. A new line had been added beneath the others, shallow and careful, stopping just short of finishing a name. My name, it hadn't been completed. I sat down slowly, understanding settling in like a weight. The stillness hadn't been a threat, it had been an invitation. Whatever lived beneath the crane was learning when I would leave, how I reacted, what boundaries I respected. Each rule wasn't just a warning, it was a test, and I had passed this one narrowly. As the night wore on, I couldn't shake the feeling that the sea was watching me move now, measuring distance, timing, patience. I avoided the cab window more than ever, keeping my focus inward. The next rule waited on the card, and I knew it wouldn't give me the option to walk away so easily. Some rules don't let you leave. After the sea moved again, I stayed in the cab longer than I needed to, pretending paperwork mattered more than the feeling crawling up my spine. The crane glass reflected my face faintly, layered over the darkness outside, and I forced myself not to stare too long. That's when I remembered Rule 7. If you see a reflection in the cab glass that does not match your movement, you must not acknowledge it, and my stomach tightened with the slow certainty that this rule existed for a reason. Reflections had always been harmless, just light and angles, nothing with intent. Out here, intent had a way of hiding inside ordinary things. At first, everything lined up the way it should. When I shifted in my seat, the reflection shifted too, delayed only by the curve of the glass. I raised a hand and watched it rise back at me, fingers trembling just slightly. The rig lights behind me cast long shapes across the cab, stretching my outline into something thin and unfamiliar. I told myself this was normal, that fear was making patterns where none existed. The longer I sat there, the harder it became to ignore the reflection altogether. It felt like someone else sharing the cab with me. Quiet and patient, I focused on the control panel instead. watching numbers update and stabilize. My reflection hovered at the edge of my vision, present without demanding attention. That restraint felt intentional. I shifted my foot, and the reflection followed a moment too late. The delay was subtle, just enough to register without being obvious. My breath caught, and my muscles tensed before I could stop them. I stayed still, counting silently, waiting to see if it would correct itself. It didn't. Slowly, deliberately, I moved my hand again. This time the reflection raised its hand first. The motion was small, restrained, like it didn't want to scare me. My heart hammered so loudly, I was sure it would echo off the glass. Every instinct screamed at me to look directly at it, to confirm what I was seeing. I stared straight ahead instead, eyes fixed on a bolt in the metal wall. The air inside the cab felt warmer, thicker, as if something else was breathing with me. I could feel the reflection watching, not through eyes exactly, but through attention. The sense of being observed pressed against my thoughts, inviting response. I clenched my jaw and forced my gaze to remain steady. Acknowledgement felt like a door I couldn't afford to open. The reflection moved again, adjusting its posture without any input from me. I caught the motion in my peripheral vision, a shift that didn't belong to physics. It leaned closer to the glass, its outline sharpening, while mine remained blurred. I felt a pull behind my eyes, the urge to turn and meet it head-on. Curiosity crept in alongside fear, whispering that seeing clearly might be safer than guessing. I reminded myself that mirrors don't show truth, they show permission. Whatever was in that glass needed recognition to finish whatever it was doing. My breathing slowed as I focused on control, on stillness. The reflection's movements became more confident, less careful. It tested distance, angle, proximity, like it was learning the limits of the space. A voice rose in my mind that wasn't quite sound, urging me to just check, just look once. It felt familiar, reasonable, like my own thoughts borrowing a different tone. I pressed my lips together and swallowed hard. Thinking about it felt dangerous, but not thinking at all felt impossible. I fixed my attention on the hum of the crane systems, grounding myself in something mechanical and dull. The reflection lifted its hand again, slower this time, fingers spreading against the glass. I could feel the pressure of that movement, even without looking directly. The cab creaked softly as temperature shifted, metal responding to stress it couldn't identify. My skin prickled, as if static filled the air. The reflection wasn't copying me anymore. I shifted my weight deliberately, testing it. The reflection didn't follow. Instead, it tilted its head, a gesture that made my stomach drop even without seeing details. That movement wasn't mine. That movement had intention behind it. I squeezed my eyes shut, refusing to give it the satisfaction of being seen. For a moment, nothing happened. The silence inside the cab stretched, thick and heavy. I wondered if I'd imagined the whole thing, if exhaustion had finally broken through my defenses. Relief crept in cautiously, like it didn't trust the quiet either. I opened my eyes slowly, keeping them forward. The reflection was closer now, its outline filling more of the glass. I could sense its presence, like a weight leaning in, curious and patient. It didn't move anymore. It didn't need to. The pressure alone felt like a question waiting to be answered. My name echoed faintly in my thoughts, not spoken, just implied. I focused on not responding, not even internally. I let the thought drift past without catching it. The effort made my head ache, a dull pressure building behind my temples. Sweat gathered at my hairline, sliding down my face. Still, I didn't look. Time lost meaning. The reflection stayed where it was, unmoving, like it understood endurance better than I did. My legs cramped from sitting too still. My hands tingled, numb from gripping the seat. Every second felt like a negotiation. I couldn't afford to lose. Finally, the pressure eased, not suddenly, but gradually, like a tide pulling back. The air cooled, and the cab felt larger, emptier. I risked a small movement, shifting my shoulders. The reflection didn't respond. I swallowed and dared to glance just enough to confirm alignment. The glass showed only me again, tired and pale, and alone. I exhaled shakily, realizing how long I'd been holding my breath. My reflection mirrored the movement exactly, obedient and empty. The relief made my hands shake. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on my knees, trying to ground myself in the reality of my own body. When my shift ended, I checked the inside wall before leaving, dreading what I might find. The list of names had grown again. Mine was still unfinished, the final letter shallow and hesitant. Someone else's name had been added below it, neat and complete. I didn't recognize it. As I stepped out of the cab, I understood something I hadn't before. Whatever lived beneath the crane didn't just want bodies. It wanted attention, recognition, agreement. Each rule was a way to deny it something it needed. The next one waited, and I knew it wouldn't be about sight or sound. The fog had rolled back in by the time my night shift started, thick and clinging, and the rig felt smaller somehow, as if the walls were pressing inward. I climbed into the crane cab with a nervous energy I could not shake, running through all the previous rules in my head. Then I remembered Rule 8. If the hook lingers over water longer than usual, you must not move it, and you must not signal anyone. And my chest tightened. The earlier nights had prepared me for anomalies, but the hook's behavior had its own rhythm, unpredictable, patient, and now it carried an awareness I didn't want to acknowledge. At first, the hook behaved normally. I swung it through small test lifts, touching only what was scheduled, dropping empty cages back onto the deck. The sea below rippled as it always had, teasing reflections and small waves. But as midnight approached, something subtle changed. The hook stopped descending after a lift, hovering just above the water's surface, motionless in a way that defied logic. I forced myself not to act, not to push any buttons, reminding myself the rule existed for a reason. Time lost all meaning as the hook lingered, suspended between air and sea. My eyes darted to gauges, levers, anything that might justify movement. The reading said nothing unusual. The weight display stayed steady. The crane felt passive, obedient, yet it had the hook frozen over black water, as if daring me to interfere. My fingers twitched over the emergency stop, but I forced them down. The rule wasn't optional. An instinct screamed that breaking it would be catastrophic. I noticed a change in the fog around the hook. It clung differently, swirling in faint eddies, reacting to the hook as if it were alive. My breath caught, and I realized how long I had been staring at the water. Minutes? Hours? I had no way of knowing. Any movement from me, any signaling to the deck below, might draw attention to what had claimed the hook. Awareness was dangerous. Observation alone was already enough. Voices carried faintly from the rig, laughter and machinery hum blending into the background. They seemed impossibly distant, as if under a layer of water I could not penetrate. The hook did not descend. It didn't need to. Its suspension was deliberate, purposeful. I felt the weight of attention pressing down from above and below simultaneously. My head throbbed from the tension of waiting. Each second felt like a test of patience, endurance, and obedience. I considered leaving the cab to check on deck, but the memory of Rule 6 reminded me that movement could be fatal. The still sea had already taught me that leaving was sometimes a necessity. Here the risk was different. Signaling, moving, or calling anyone could provoke whatever waited beneath the hook. I swallowed, my throat dry, and focused on controlled breathing. Observation alone was a rule I had to respect. The fog thickened around the hook, obscuring its base, but not its outline against the faint lights of the rig. My reflection in the cab glass caught my attention, reminding me of the last rule and the thin line between awareness and acknowledgement. I shifted slightly, careful not to signal or gesture. The hook remained suspended, and the water beneath reflected nothing but black emptiness. I knew that stillness was not silence. Something was beneath the surface, waiting. Every instinct urged me to act, to test, to move the hook and break the tension. I clenched my fists, pressing them into the chair, forcing my muscles to obey. The air in the cab felt alive, thick with the scent of metal and sea, almost sweet, almost welcoming. The hovering hook felt like a question, a warning, a reminder that compliance mattered more than knowledge. I focused on the sound of the crane motors, humming steadily, like a heartbeat I could control. Minutes stretched longer, shadows danced faintly on the crane frame, influenced by the fog and lights, or perhaps something more. The hook didn't move. My thoughts wavered, wanting to reason, to explain away the impossibility. I reminded myself of the rule's simplicity. Do nothing, say nothing, move nothing. The balance was delicate. I couldn't afford curiosity. I couldn't afford defiance. Suddenly, a faint ripple spread across the water's surface, subtle but deliberate, like something had moved beneath the hook, without disturbing the suspended load. My stomach tightened, and I felt the familiar cold pressure creeping up my spine. The hook stayed perfectly still, as if whatever existed below had paused, waiting for me to misstep. I pressed my palms flat on my thighs, muscles trembling, silent. Hours passed like this, the hook lingering, the fog thickening, the water beneath dark and unknowable. I didn't breathe loudly, didn't move, didn't blink more than necessary. Any slight adjustment felt like it could invite attention. I realized with growing terror that waiting was itself a form of danger, but action would be immediate death. The balance between life and knowledge had never felt so sharp. When the first light of dawn touched the rig, the hook finally began to descend on its own, gently, smoothly, as if the night's ordeal had ended by decree rather than choice. The fog thinned, revealing calm, ordinary water again. I exhaled shakily, understanding that I had survived by following the rule exactly. Any deviation could have been catastrophic. The lesson was clear, etched deeper than any card or warning. Even as the day progressed, I avoided looking at the water too closely, avoiding movement that might draw attention. The names on the cab wall had grown again. Another shallow etching appeared beneath the last. I didn't recognize it. I didn't want to. The rules were patient, methodical, and unrelenting. I knew the next one would push boundaries in ways I had not yet endured. That night I climbed into the crane cab, with the exhaustion of weeks pressing down, my mind replaying every rule so far. I glanced at the laminated card, noting Rule 9. If the lights on the rig flicker in a pattern, you must not react until you understand its meaning, and felt a shiver run up my spine. The previous lessons weighed heavily on me. The fog, the hook, the still water, they had all been warnings I hadn't fully understood, until it was almost too late. Now a new challenge waited, invisible yet unavoidable. The rig hummed with the usual mechanical sounds, the sea lapping quietly against the support beams. My eyes kept flicking to the lights overhead, their glow consistent, predictable. But as midnight approached, subtle irregularities began. A brief dimming here, a faint flicker there, small enough that at first I could convince myself it was fatigue, a trick of the eyes. Still the rule echoed in my mind. Do not react, observation only. A rhythm emerged gradually, almost imperceptibly, like the lights were breathing in a language I couldn't yet read. My heartbeat accelerated, muscles tensing as I resisted the urge to flip switches, to reset circuits, to call someone. The crane remained still beneath me, obedient, and I realized I was the only conscious element in this pattern. My focus narrowed until the rig seemed to vanish around me, leaving only the cab, the lights, and the dark ocean beyond. The flicker repeated, more insistent now, pulsing in a pattern, almost musical, almost deliberate. I felt the weight of its intent pressing on my chest. It wasn't random. I knew that instinctively. Every instinct screamed to react, to throw a breaker, to turn on backup lights. But I remembered the rule, and my fingers stayed still. Observation was the only safety. Comprehension before action. Anything else would be catastrophic. I began to notice subtle differences. One light dimmed longer than another, one blinked twice, while another blinked 3 times. My mind tried to catalog, to make sense, to predict the next sequence. But the pattern shifted, changed, like the lights themselves were testing me. It wasn't just a warning anymore. It was communication, recognition of understanding, or lack thereof, could mean the difference between survival and oblivion. Sweat beaded on my forehead as I forced myself to ignore instinct and focus solely on the sequence. The fog outside thickened, muffling distant voices, and the only sound was the hum of machinery and the rhythmic flicker above. My muscles ached from tension, from resisting movement, from the stress of pure observation. Time became meaningless. Seconds stretched like hours. Each flicker felt like a pulse against my very consciousness. The hook below me moved slightly, almost in tandem with the flickers, though the gauges didn't reflect any weight or movement. I realized that every element of the rig, every detail of this isolated world, was tied together. One mistake, one premature action, could reverberate through the system, and whatever controlled the lights would know. Fear became a physical weight, pressing down on my shoulders, forcing me to hold perfectly still. A sudden change made me catch my breath. The flicker pattern shifted abruptly, faster now, almost urgent. I felt the pull of instinct again, a desire to act, to stabilize, to interfere. My stomach churned. I clenched my fists and pressed them into the seat, grounding myself. Understanding had to come first. Only comprehension could save me. The lights weren't threats. They were guides, or judges. Minutes or perhaps hours passed, and I began to see the pattern's logic. It wasn't random at all. The sequence repeated with subtle variations, each shift indicating caution, attention, and the presence of something beneath the surface. My body relaxed slightly, knowing that recognition was half the battle. Acting too soon would have invited consequences I couldn't imagine. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the lights stabilized in a steady glow, signaling that the sequence had ended. The hook stopped its subtle sway, and the rig returned to its normal hum. I exhaled shakily, realizing I had survived another night by following the rule exactly. Any reaction before understanding would have been fatal. Observation and patience had preserved me. I glanced at the cab wall, and the names had shifted once again. Another shallow etching appeared beneath the last, faint but deliberate, like a signature of approval or warning. My name was closer to completion than before, but not yet finished. The rules were still teaching, still testing, still demanding compliance. I understood then that each lesson built on the last, preparing me for something worse yet to come. The dawn light spilled across the rig, teasing normalcy, but I knew better. The flickers were still there, embedded in memory, reminding me of the fragility of safety. I left the cab slowly, aware that each step was under observation. The next rule waited, more insistent, more dangerous, and I knew it would challenge the boundaries I had just learned to respect. That night I felt a fatigue deeper than any physical tiredness, the kind that seeps into your bones and refuses to leave. I climbed into the cab, the crane lights humming dimly, and glanced at the laminated card. Rule 10. If you hear a sound coming from inside the rig that has no source, you must not investigate alone, pulsed in my mind like a warning light. I had already survived so many tests by obeying the rules, but I knew instinct would push me toward curiosity, toward danger disguised as necessity. Fear and logic warred in my chest, each heartbeat louder than the last. The rig groaned in its usual fashion, metal stretching and settling, engines thrumming in steady harmony. But as midnight approached, subtle irregularities began to creep in. A soft tapping, rhythmic but irregular, echoed faintly through the structure. I froze, listening, muscles stiffened. It wasn't machinery. I could feel it more than hear it, vibrations against the steel that had no explanation. The air suddenly seemed too thick, too heavy, as if each breath drew in more tension. I wanted to investigate. My hands itched to grab a flashlight, to step onto the platform, to follow the sound. Every fiber of my being screamed that understanding meant survival. But the rule reminded me otherwise. Alone, I could not confront it. I clenched my fists and focused on the control panel, eyes wide, heart pounding. Moving toward it would be inviting whatever waded into direct contact. Stillness was the only protection. The tapping grew louder, closer, yet the source remained impossible to locate. It moved across the rig, echoing through corridors and beams that should have absorbed sound. I strained my ears, trying to triangulate, but it slipped between comprehension and awareness. Panic pressed at the edges of my mind. I could feel my skin prickle as the unknown presence explored the rig, probing for reaction, waiting for a breach. Obedience was fragile, but mandatory. Minutes or hours, I could not tell, passed with the sound wandering, teasing, never pausing long enough to pin down. My muscles cramped from tension. My reflection in the cab window stared back, pale and exhausted, a reminder of isolation. Every instinct urged me to act, to grab something, to check, but doing so alone would be catastrophic. I pressed my palms flat to the chair, grounding myself, repeating the rule internally. Suddenly, a louder thump reverberated directly beneath the crane. The metal groaned in response, and a vibration ran up the arm into my seat. My stomach dropped, and I realized the movement wasn't mechanical. Whatever made the sound was intangible, yet undeniably present. I forced myself to breathe slowly, to count in my head, to resist the urge to investigate. Survival required patience, silence, and refusal. The noise shifted, moving across the cab in ways impossible for any known object. I imagined shadows stretching along the walls, as though the presence beneath the crane was extending itself upward, testing boundaries, feeling for reaction. My mind screamed to act, to run, to follow. I swallowed hard, resisting every fiber of temptation. Alone, there could be no confrontation. Only compliance kept the threat contained. I sat trembling, listening as the pattern of sounds changed, slower, deliberate, as if whatever existed was observing me as carefully as I observed it. The crane felt alive in response, not through hydraulics, but through anticipation, tension, patience. I realized that each rule was a lesson in control, not obedience. Learning control over my fear, my instincts, my body, was as vital as avoiding direct danger. Hours dragged on, the sounds ebbed and flowed, never repeating identically, never allowing me to pinpoint origin. I wanted to close my eyes, to sleep, but I dared not. Attention was required. Isolation was a weakness. I clutched the edge of the cab seat, whispering nothing to myself, acknowledging nothing in thought or voice. The rule had become a lifeline, a tether to the possibility of surviving another night. Eventually, as the first hints of dawn touched the rig, the sounds diminished, retreating as though whatever had explored was satisfied. The crane arm relaxed, lights steadied, and the fog outside thinned. I exhaled shakily, muscles still trembling, aware that compliance had preserved me. Looking back, I realized I had been lucky, or careful enough to survive the test. Alone, even the smallest curiosity could have been fatal. Before leaving the cab, I checked the metal wall again. Another name had been etched faintly beneath the last. My own was closer to completion than ever. I understood then that each rule built towards something inevitable, something I had yet to face. The final lesson waited, and I knew it would demand everything I had learned to survive. The weight of the unknown pressed down like the ocean itself. The final night had arrived, thick with fog and the low hum of the rig, and I climbed into the crane cab with every nerve taut. My hands trembled as I held the laminated card. The list of rules pressed to my chest. Rule 11. If you see a shadow moving independently of any object or person, you must not speak, move, or look away until it disappears. Stared back at me, simple in its phrasing but impossible in execution. I had followed 10 rules already, barely surviving each, and now the last one waited, patient and absolute, as if it had been growing stronger with each previous test. The lights of the rig flickered faintly, and the fog pressed in from all sides, suffocating and thick. The crane arm rested idle, hook above the water, and every other rule I had endured whispered warnings in my mind. I tried to steady my breathing, reminding myself that observation and patience had preserved me so far. Outside, the sea was dark, deep, and still, the surface reflecting nothing but shadows of steel. I understood instinctively that this rule demanded perfect immobility, not just of the body, but of thought, of fear, of acknowledgement itself. A subtle movement caught my attention in the corner of the cab glass. At first I thought it was a reflection, another trick of light, but then it moved again, deliberately, independently, untethered to any object or person. My stomach churned as I realized that the shadow had form, yet was formless. It obeyed no rules of physics I could understand. The instinct to flinch, to look away, or to call someone was overwhelming, but I clenched my jaw, gripping the seat tightly, muscles coiled. Doing anything could invite it closer. Minutes, or what felt like hours, passed with the shadow creeping along the cab walls, shifting shapes, sometimes stretching impossibly long, sometimes shrinking into impossible compactness. I could feel it observing me, testing patience, testing compliance. My heart pounded so loudly, it felt like it would echo throughout the entire rig. I didn't speak. I didn't move. I didn't breathe more than necessary, knowing any hint of acknowledgement could tip the balance. Every rule I had learned led to this moment. The fog outside thickened further, muffling every distant noise, leaving only the hum of the crane and the soft pulse of the shadow. It hovered near the hook, stretching across the water's reflection, twisting without touching. I felt the weight of unseen eyes pressing from below and behind. I realized then that the shadow was not just an anomaly, it was the culmination of all the lessons, the essence of every test. Patience, obedience, silence, stillness, all had led to confronting this presence. My body screamed to act. I wanted to leave the cab, to close my eyes, to deny its existence. My mind whispered frantic rationalizations. Shadows are tricks, reflections, nothing real, but I knew better. Each rule had punished arrogance, curiosity, impulsiveness. I had survived this far by adhering exactly, and now any deviation would undo all that. My teeth ached from clenching, my legs cramped from sitting frozen, but I did not move. I could feel it, breathing around me, coiling in anticipation, measuring my resolve. Hours dragged on, yet the shadow neither attacked nor vanished. Its movement was independent, deliberate, almost intelligent. The cab glass captured its silhouette, stretching over metal and fog, coiling in corners, as if seeking acknowledgement. My senses were stretched thin. Every sound, every vibration, every light flicker seemed amplified, demanding reaction, yet I forced my attention solely on remaining motionless, silent, unbroken. Compliance was my shield, though it felt impossibly fragile. Finally, the first hint of dawn's light pierced the fog, diffusing across the rig. The shadow paused, then gradually dissolved, leaving only ordinary darkness behind. I exhaled shakily, muscles trembling from the tension of immobility. The hook, the crane, the fog, the water, all returned to a deceptive calm. The cab felt empty again, the weight of presence lifted, but not gone. I understood that Rule 11 had tested more than courage. It had tested the ability to surrender control completely, to endure observation without participation. Before leaving, I checked the cab wall once more. The last name, mine, had been etched fully, clear and deliberate, marking completion of the lessons. A hollow relief filled me. The rules had been survived, learned and etched into memory. Yet deep in my chest, I understood the shadow would wait for the next observer. Patient, patient, always patient. Survival had been won by obedience alone, and obedience had a cost, awareness of what truly lurks beyond human control. I stepped out onto the rig deck, staring at the calm ocean below, still fog rolling off into the horizon. The crane towered above, seemingly innocent, yet I knew every shadow, every reflection, every still moment carried a presence beyond comprehension. The rules were not just instructions, they were boundaries separating life from the abyss. I felt the weight of knowledge press down like the sea itself, endless and patient. As I walked away, I couldn't shake the certainty that the shadow had taught me more than fear. It had taught endurance, stillness, and the fragile line between life and what waits beneath. Even in daylight, I felt its presence, a whisper behind the fog, and knew the lessons of the rig were never truly over. The rules remain, patient, eternal, waiting for the next hand to follow or fail. If you enjoyed this story, like, share, and subscribe for more.